In today's video, we're going to learn how Hamas fights their wars. Let's get started.
Why would a battle fought 54 years ago provide key insight on what Hamas's strategy is today? Asymmetric warfare. It's a term that most people don't really understand. Before I did this, I was a United States Army Green Beret, and I did a couple of combat tours in Iraq. And needless to say, asymmetric warfare was kind of our thing. So in practical terms, it is a type of war between belligerents whose relative military power, strategy, or tactics differ significantly. And as a result of this, the weaker opponent will use unconventional tactics in order to maximize one's strengths against a stronger opponent's weaknesses or vulnerabilities. For instance, an insurgent force does not have the freedom of movement or firepower necessary to attack a forward operating base or a heavily armed column. So instead, they focus on softer logistical targets. They may choose to use a remotely activated roadside bomb instead of engaging in direct fire. In many situations, the weaker adversary has fewer personnel and resources, and so a significant part of their strategy is to preserve those limited resources and use the munitions that they have to the greatest possible advantage. But here's the thing. To pull this off long term, you generally need a consistent means of supply combined with enough territory to hit, run, and then hide. And Hamas doesn't have these things, at least not in sufficient supply to win against the IDF. So what's their strategy?
Before he continues, that's why Hamas attacked the kibbutzim, the settlements around the Gaza Strip. They do have something called kitat konanut, or in English it would be a preparation active duty. I don't exactly know how to call it, but they have like these small units inside the kibbutzim that are there for security, but they're not as big as the IDF to provide sufficient security to the people living there. So that's why they specifically focused on the kibbutzim. That's why they focused on the Nova. That's why they focused on the bases that were nearby. And yeah, let's continue.
Can Hamas leverage that will allow them to conduct offensive operations against a much stronger opponent and then avoid getting destroyed by the IDF's vastly superior military capability? And the answer to that question, as horrific as it is civilian casualties, but probably not the ones you're thinking. To understand this, let's discuss that example 54 years ago. The Tet Offensive in the Vietnam War virtually wiped out the Viet Cong. It was by every objective measure a complete tactical failure, but strategically, it was invaluable. Because while achieving none of its military objectives, the Tet Offensive shattered Americans' perspective on the situation on the ground. Opponents of the war were able to effectively use the offensive as a demonstration of the futility of American involvement. Hollywood, academia, and many in the mainstream media went to work convincing the American people that the war couldn't be won, or perhaps just shouldn't even be fought. And in a representative government, when the electorate decides that a war is lost, it is, regardless of the situation on the ground. Now, understand something. I'm not making an argument for the pros or cons of fighting the Vietnam War. I'm merely illustrating a point about modern asymmetric warfare. The lesson of the Tet Offensive is when fighting the West, you don't defeat their military. You win their electorate. And the way to do that is through the institutions which shape culture in the West, namely Hollywood, the media, and academia. If Hamas had decided to engage in a conventional military attack directed at only legitimate military targets, the IDF would have effectively destroyed their warfighting capability within days, and Hamas knows it. So they engaged in asymmetric strategy. Once we understand this, their actions on October 7th, as horrific as they are, begin to make more sense. Hamas didn't just target civilians because they were easy targets or because they despised Jews, although both of those things are true. The attack and the subsequent taking of hostages was actually designed to elicit a major response from the IDF. But why? Well, maybe it's because to achieve their...
Interesting. The fact that they chose to target specifically civilians and to take civilian hostages was to prevent a stronger attack from Israel. Now, if they would have only targeted military bases, then the response of the IDF in Gaza would have been a complete destruction for their actions. But because they have Israeli civilians and babies and whatnot, the IDF cannot hit as hard as they could have if only the IDF was involved.
Strategic objectives, Hamas needs civilian casualties, and more specifically, they need Palestinian civilian casualties. and this is why. The two entities in this conflict that lose the most from a greater peace agreement in the Middle East are Iran and the terrorist organizations they support. Upsetting this process requires much more than the random launching of rockets into Israel or strikes against legitimate military targets. The IDF is more than capable of handling such incursions, and the Israeli people have become all too accustomed to weathering such attacks without demanding an overwhelming military response. Something more significant was required.
By the way, just for your information, the Israelis around the Gaza Strip have been enduring rocket attacks since the 2000s. The rocket attacks became more significant starting 2006, 2007, when Hamas was elected into power, and then they started firing thousands of rockets into Israel. Whenever you see those lists saying Gaza Massacre 2014, Gaza Massacre 2008, Gaza Massacre whatever, know that all of the Gaza massacres were attacks that were launched by Hamas in Gaza towards Israel, and then Israel retaliated. The Arabs then called it a massacre because some civilians died in an act of war that their own people started. Go figure.
October 7th created the kind of conditions that demanded a significant and sustained response. They needed something so obscene that Israel would have no choice but to hit back hard. And this is where the second component of Hamas's strategy plays out: how to get Palestinian casualties. Any government actually worried about civilian casualties.
Let me answer. You hide behind the civilians, you hide your rockets and munition behind the civilians next to refugee camps, you hide it next to hospitals, you hide it next to high casualty targets if the IDF attacks. A legitimate military target, by the way, which is allowed to attack according to international law. If Hamas uses a hospital to hide their rockets, to hide their terrorists, to hide whatever, it is no longer used for humanitarian purposes, and it turns it into a legitimate military objective.
Dedicates resources to evacuating their own civilians from hostile areas and attempts to separate the civilian population from legitimate military targets. So what conclusion should we come to when a governing body decides to do the exact opposite? In this asymmetric environment, Hamas is not only incentivized to kill Israeli civilians, they're incentivized to maximize their own civilian casualties in the short run in order to elicit Western intervention on their behalf. As easy as it might be to explain Hamas's strategy away as nothing but mindless bloodlust, it is actually more sinister than that. Hamas is responding to the incentive structures certain elements within the West have created. Hamas understands that the real battlefield is not in Gaza, but in the streets, university halls, and newsrooms of the West. And so that is their target.
They understand that the more babies that die, the more children that die, the more women that die, the more destruction the world sees, the more the world is going to get upset, the more the world is going to react emotionally, and the more the world is going to demand for this war to stop. They know it perfectly well because this has been used in the region since 1948. Yasser Arafat was a master of exactly that.
And while a ceasefire seems like a humanitarian response to the tragic death of civilians, leaving Hamas intact as an operational and governing body will ultimately just reinforce that the perverse incentive structure remains the same. And that while the West may claim to not negotiate with terrorists, they always seem to force Israel to as soon as it becomes politically inconvenient for them. So here's the hard reality. If you actually want to achieve anything resembling a lasting peace in this part of the world, you're never going to achieve it by creating conditions where terrorists are incentivized to hurt both the civilians of their enemies and their own in order to achieve their political objectives.
Israel, since the beginning of this war, said that there's only two objectives to end this war. One, Hamas gets removed from power because Hamas over and over again said that the Israelis and that the Jews need to be eradicated. They said that October 7th is just the beginning. They said that October 7th should happen again and again and again. So how can you leave such body in power? You absolutely can't. No country in the right mind will let that happen. Now, if you think about the other objective, the fact that the hostages are there, which prevents Israel to attack hard, is also another tactic of Hamas. Hamas tries to create the most destruction, the most civilian casualties. They truly don't care about their own civilians. That's why they take the humanitarian aid. That's why they operate within civilian population, because it's all a part of a tactic. It's all a part of a brilliant marketing tactic. If we hide behind civilians, if we take the humanitarian aid to starve the civilians, despite the fact that the civilians don't actually starve. I've seen videos of the civilians looking perfectly fine. But if we take the humanitarian aid trucks and they don't get to the civilians, they will complain. The world will see. The world will cry. The world will react emotionally, and the world will then demand this war to stop. Despite the fact that we started this war, we are going to invert the attention towards Israel and how Israel is the enemy and how Israel should be sanctioned. This is the reality, and this is what Hamas does every single war. They're amazing at it. Anyways, thank you for watching this video. Please don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. And I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.